Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to the BeQuran Podcast. I'm Ali.
And I'm Fatima. In today's deep dive, we're exploring one of the most sensitive and often misunderstood topics in Islamic history, the compilation and preservation of the Holy Quran.
For years, the Shia community has faced accusations, claims that we believe in a different Quran or that we hold views of tahrif or alteration. But today, we're flipping the lens.
Exactly. Instead of focusing on defending these claims, we're examining Sunni sources themselves, going into Sahih Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, and other respected narrations to uncover what they really say about missing verses, variant readings, and early Quranic codices.
You'll hear about surprising reports like the verse of stoning, verses allegedly eaten by a sheep, and companions who recalled different versions of the same surahs.
But we're not here to sensationalize. Our aim is to understand the historical complexities and scholarly debates that have existed within the broader Islamic tradition.
Because true unity isn't built on silence, it's built on understanding. And that starts by facing the history, even the uncomfortable parts, with honesty.
So, join us as we unpack the layers of Quranic transmission, challenge assumptions, and explore what it all really means.
Let's get started. Bismillah. You know, sometimes exploring a topic is like peeling an onion. You think you know it, but there are just layers upon layers underneath.
Absolutely.
And seemingly simple subjects can hold really profound complexities.
That's exactly what we're doing today. Our focus is the Holy Quran. We're looking into its compilation, how it's been preserved, and some of the surprising discussions around it that have gone on for centuries.
Yeah, and it's a topic that often, well, it comes with a specific charge, doesn't it? Particularly aimed at the Shia community. For years, they've faced this accusation that they have a different Quran or believe it was altered, tahrif al-Quran. It's a very heavy claim in Islamic discourse.
It really is, yeah.
So our mission for this deep dive is actually to step back a bit from those specific debates.
Okay.
We're going to rigorously analyze Sunni literature, the sources from the non-Shia tradition.
Right, looking within that framework itself.
Exactly. We want to explore if non-Shia narrations also bring up interesting questions, things about the Quran structure, maybe potential missing verses, different readings. Think of this as maybe your shortcut, a way to get a real handle on a topic that many find confusing, but without getting totally overwhelmed by all the details at once.
Sounds good. So where do we begin? Maybe with the basics of Quranic sciences?
Good idea.
Right. So this is basically the scholarly field that studies how the Holy Quran was compiled. Who were the key people involved? How did it become the standard text we see today? It's more than just reading it then.
Oh, much more. It's the history behind the text.
Okay, so during the Prophet Muhammad's lifetime, peace be upon him, he had specific people writing things down, right? Scribes.
Yes, figures like Imam Ali, Abdullah ibn Masud, Zayd ibn Thabit. They were known scribes. But, and this is key, isn't it? Written text wasn't the main thing back then.
Not primarily, no. Oral transmission was far more common, and importantly, it was generally considered more reliable.
Right. People were praised for their memory.
Exactly. Memorizing vast amounts of poetry, genealogy, scripture. That was the highly valued skill.
Okay. And you mentioned Imam Ali. Didn't he have his own collection?
He did. That's an interesting point. He apparently had his own unique codex or mushaf.
And what was different about it?
Well, the sources say it wasn't just the verses. It actually included the order in which they were revealed.
Oh, chronological order.
Yes, and even some exegesis, sort of interpretation alongside the text itself.
But this specific version, it wasn't adopted by the early Islamic government after the Prophet.
Okay, so the Prophet passes away. What happens next regarding the Quran? This seems like a critical moment.
It was. The first caliph, Abu Bakr, he faced a real dilemma, according to the narrations, which was
whether to compile a single unified book, something the Prophet himself hadn't explicitly ordered or done in that final collected form.
So it wasn't an obvious step.
Apparently not initially. The narrative suggests Zayd ibn Thabit, one of the scribes we mentioned, was eventually persuaded to take on this huge task.
Okay.
And then there's that rather curious detail you sometimes hear.
The one about where it was kept?
Yes, reportedly once this first compilation was done, this mushaf, it was stored, well, under Aisha's bed.
Under the bed. Okay. That's specific.
It is. Now, fast forward a bit, this brings us to the standardization process under the third caliph.
Right. He's the one associated with the Quran we generally use today.
Correct. He undertook this massive project to create the single standardized text. And why was that needed? What was the context?
Well, Islam was spreading incredibly fast across huge new regions, different cultures, different languages.
So variations started appearing.
Exactly. Different readings, different recitations began to emerge, sometimes influenced by local dialects, sometimes by different understandings of the verses. So Uthman's effort was really a direct response to that, trying to unify everyone under one single authoritative version of the text.
Okay, that sets the stage nicely. Now, you mentioned different readings. Let's tackle these concepts. Ahruf and Qira'at. They sound complicated.
They are. Honestly, this is where it gets
Quite.
technical and, frankly, debated among scholars.
So, what's the basic idea? Well, tradition tells us the Prophet revealed the Quran in multiple ahruf, often translated as modes or ways of revelation.
Okay, multiple modes.
Yes, and then from these ahruf stem the different qira'at, which are the specific recitations or readings.
And these aren't just like different accents. It can be more than that.
Sometimes it involves slightly different wording or emphasis, potentially impacting meaning, though usually subtly. It's complex.
How complex are we talking?
We'll put it this way. Imam Suyuti, a giant in Islamic scholarship, he listed something like 40 different scholarly opinions just on what a harf actually means.
40. Wow.
And even someone like Sheikh Mufid, a hugely respected scholar, when asked about a harf, he apparently just said he had no opinion on it.
He just didn't know.
Pretty much admitted it was too perplexing. That really shows you the level of, let's say, ambiguity, even among top scholars.
Right. And that complexity, that ambiguity, maybe brings us to that comment by Sayed Ammar Nakshawani, the one that...
Yes, when he said the narrative has holes.
Exactly. Can you clarify what he likely meant by that? Because it sounds quite provocative.
Sure. Given the context of these discussions on Ahruf and Qira'at, it seems clear he was referring to these specific technical historical issues, the difficulties in reconciling all the accounts about modes and readings.
So not about the Quran's overall preservation necessarily.
No, not questioning the core message or its general protection, but pointing out the unresolved scholarly knots in the historical narrative of its transmission and variations.
That definitely touched the nerve.
Oh, absolutely. It sparked some very strong reactions. People interpreted it perhaps much more broadly than intended.
Okay, so sticking with these historical sources, particularly within the Sunni tradition, now, do we find narrations that talk about verses being, well, missing or changed?
We do find narrations that are, let's say, quite startling when you first encounter them.
Like what?
Consider an account from Aisha. This is found in Sunan ibn Majah, which is a respected collection of hadith, sayings and actions of the Prophet.
Okay, what did she say?
She narrated that specific verses were revealed, one related to rajam, stoning adulterers to death, and another about a ruling involving 10 sucklings, basically breastfeeding a young man 10 times to establish a foster-son relationship.
Okay. Verses were revealed on these topics.
Yes, but then she says these verses were abrogated, meaning their ruling was canceled.
By a later revelation. Right. Abrogation is a known concept.
But here's the part that raises eyebrows. She adds that the written text of these abrogated verses was on a sheet of paper under her bed.
Okay.
Under the bed.
That's specific.
It is. Now, fast forward a bit. This brings us to the standardization process under the third caliph.
Right. He's the one associated with the Quran we generally use today.
Correct. He undertook this massive project to create the single standardized text. And why was that needed?
What was the context?
Well, Islam was spreading incredibly fast across huge new regions, different cultures, different languages.
So variations started appearing.
Exactly. Different readings, different recitations began to emerge, sometimes influenced by local dialects, sometimes by different understandings of the verses. So Usman's effort was really a direct response to that, trying to unify everyone under one single authoritative version of the text.
Okay, that's it.
Okay, that sets the stage nicely. Now, you mentioned different readings. Let's tackle these concepts.
Ahruf and Qira'at, they sound complicated. They are. Honestly, this is where it gets quite
Technical and, frankly, debated among scholars.
So what's the basic idea? Well, tradition tells us the Prophet revealed the Quran in multiple Ahruf, often translated as modes or ways of revelation.
Okay, multiple modes.
Yes. And then from these Ahruf stem the different Qira'at, which are the specific recitations or readings.
And these aren't just like different accents. It can be more than that.
Sometimes it involves slightly different wording or emphasis, potentially impacting meaning, though usually subtly. It's complex.
How complex are we talking?
We'll put it this way. Imam Suyuti, a giant in Islamic scholarship, he listed something like 40 different scholarly opinions just on what Ahruf actually means.
40. Wow.
And even someone like Sheikh Mufti, a hugely respected scholar, when asked about Ahruf, apparently said he just had no opinion on it.
He just didn't know.
Pretty much admitted it was too perplexing. That really shows you the level of, let's say, ambiguity, even among top scholars.
Right, and that complexity, that ambiguity maybe brings us to that comment by Sayed Ammar Nakshawani, the one that caused the stir.
Ah, yes, when he said the narrative has holes.
Exactly. Can you clarify what he likely meant by that? Because it sounds quite provocative.
Sure. Given the context of these discussions on Ahruf and Qira'at, it seems clear he was referring to these specific technical historical issues, the difficulties in reconciling all the accounts about modes and readings.
So not about the Quran's overall preservation necessarily.
No, not questioning the core message or its general protection, but pointing out the unresolved scholarly knots in the historical narrative of its transmission and variations.
That it definitely touched a nerve.
Oh, absolutely. It sparked some very strong reactions. People interpreted it perhaps much more broadly than intended.
Okay, so sticking with these historical sources, particularly within the Sunni tradition now, do we find narrations that talk about verses being, well, missing or changed?
We do find narrations that are, say, quite startling when you first encounter them.
Like what?
Consider an account from Aisha. This is found in Sunan Ibn Majah, which is a respected collection of hadith sayings and actions of the Prophet.
Okay, what did she say?
She narrated that specific verses were revealed, one related to rajim, stoning adulterers to death, and another about a ruling involving 10 sucklings, basically breastfeeding a young man 10 times to establish a foster-son relationship.
Okay, verses were revealed on these topics.
Yes. But then she says these verses were abrogated, meaning their ruling was canceled.
By a later revelation. Right. Abrogation is a known concept.
But here's the part that raises eyebrows. She adds that the written text of these abrogated verses was on a sheet of paper under her bed.
Okay.
And after the Prophet's death, a domestic animal, often translated as a goat or sheep, came in and ate it.
Ate the paper with the verses on it. That's the narration. Wow. Okay. So putting that aside for a second, is there actually a verse commanding stoning for adultery in the Quran we have today?
No, there isn't. The prescribed punishment in the current Quran is flogging.
Interesting. So that leads us somewhere else, doesn't it?
It connects directly to another really significant narration, this time involving Umar, the second caliph.
Okay. What about Umar?
In a sermon recorded in Sunan Abu Dawud, another major hadith collection, Umar expressed this fear.
A fear about what?
He feared that as time went on, people would abandon the obligation of stoning adulterers.
Why?
Because, he said, they wouldn't find the verse for it in the Book of Allah.
In the Quran. So he acknowledged it wasn't written there in his time.
It seems so. He reportedly even said that if he didn't fear being accused of adding something to the Quran, he would have written the verse about stoning into the Musaf himself.
Wow, okay. That's quite a statement from someone like Umar.
It is, and he also confirmed in that same context that the Prophet did implement stoning, and so did the caliphs after him. So the practice existed, but the verse he implies was not in the written text.
Now, doesn't this remind you of that story from Sahih Bukhari, the one with the Jewish community?
Yes, that's a fascinating parallel, where they brought adulterers to the Prophet.
Right. And they tried to hide the verse about stoning in their own scripture, the Torah.
Exactly. And Abdullah ibn Salam, a Jewish convert to Islam, pointed it out. So there's this intertextual element, too.
So one explanation people offer for Omar's statement is what? That maybe he was confused?
Yeah, some suggest that perhaps, given the overlap in laws between the traditions, maybe he was confusing something he knew from the Torah with what he thought should be, or perhaps once was, in the Quran.
But hang on. His quote, as reported, sounds pretty definite. I confirm that the penalty of stoning be inflicted. He sounds very sure about the ruling and its basis. Would someone of his stature, that close to the Prophet, really be that muddled about the source of such a major ruling?
That's the question, isn't it? It certainly prompts reflection on how these
things were understood and transmitted back then.
It really does. Okay, are there other examples like this about missing parts or significant variations?
Oh, yes. There's another really striking one, this time from Ubayy ibn Ka'b. He was another very prominent companion known for his Quranic knowledge.
And what did he say?
This is from where?
This is reported in the Sahih Muslim, another one of the most authoritative hadith collections for Sunnis.
Okay.
Ubayy ibn Ka'b stated that Surah Al-Asab,
which is chapter 33. Right, I know that one.
It has, 73 verses today?
Exactly, 73 verses in the current Uthmanic text.
Ubayy reportedly said that they used to recite it as being as long as Surah Al-Baqarah.
Wait, Al-Baqarah. This chapter 2. That's the longest chapter in the Quran. It's 86 verses. So Ubayy ibn Ka'b is saying chapter 33 used to be as long as chapter 2?
That means over 200 verses are just not there anymore, according to him. That's the implication of his statement as recorded in Sahih Muslim.
Where did roughly 200 verses go?
The narration doesn't elaborate further on that point.
That's quite astonishing. A goat couldn't eat that many verses.
No, indeed. And these aren't just isolated curiosities. There are other reported variant readings.
Such as?
Well, Ubayy ibn Ka'b is also associated with another unique line, not found in our Quran today. Something like, if the son of Adam had 2 valleys of wealth, he would still wish for a third.
Sounds like a wisdom saying, but not in the current text.
Correct. Then there's Abdal Nahas, another major figure. He reportedly had a variant reading of Surah 33, verse 6, the verse about the Prophet's wives being mothers of the believers.
Yes, his reported reading added the phrase, and he is their father, referring to the Prophet. That phrase isn't in the standard text.
Interesting. You want any others?
There's Ibn Masud again. He was a hugely important early figure regarding the Quran.
Yes. His reported variant reading of Surah 4, verse 24, that's the verse often linked to temporary marriage, or muta, supposedly included the explicit phrase, for a specified term, ila ajalin musama.
Which makes the connection to temporary marriage much more direct.
Much more explicit, yes. That phrase is not in the Uthmanic text we have.
Okay, this is already a lot. But there's an even serious allegation.
Involving Ibn Masud, isn't there?
There is, and it's quite sensitive. There are reports or allegations found in some historical sources that Abdullah ibn Masud used to deny that the last 2 surahs of the Quran, Al-Falaq and An-Nas, often called Al-Mu'awwithatain, the chapters of refuge, he denied they were part of the Quran. The allegation is that he considered them prayers or incantations, not divine revelation on par with the rest, and would supposedly even omit them from his personal copy, his mushaf.
Wow.
Given his stature, that's significant.
Yeah.
It's extremely significant, and the sources discussing this highlight how serious it is. Some later scholars, particularly from the Hanbali school, consider holding such a belief that parts of the universally accepted Quran are not actually Quranic to be tantamount to disbelief or apostasy.
It really shows the gravity of these discussions within the tradition itself.
Absolutely. It underscores how high the stakes were and are when discussing the integrity and precise content of the Quranic text. So, okay, let's try to bring this all together. We started with that common accusation against Shia Muslims about having a different Quran or believing in tahrif.
Right. But now, after diving deep into these Sunni sources, Sahih Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, the Sunan collections, accounts from figures like Aisha, Umar, Ubayy ibn Ka'b, ibn Masud.
What does this show us?
Well, I think it reveals that the historical reality, even within the Sunni tradition itself, is perhaps far more dynamic and complex than is often presented.
Less monolithic.
Exactly. The idea of a perfectly smooth, unquestioned transmission isn't fully borne out by their own foundational texts. These narrations about abrogation, eaten verses, missing sections, variant readings by major companions, they exist within that heritage.
And just to be crystal clear, our aim here isn't to say one side is right or wrong or to prove the Quran was altered. No, not at all.
The point is understanding the historical landscape.
Right.
It's about seeing the different narratives, the scholarly debates, the complexities that actually exist within the broader Islamic heritage, including the Sunni tradition.
Being truly well-informed, you could say, means grappling with these specific details. It's allowing for those aha moments when you realize the story is richer and maybe messier than you thought.
Understanding the tapestry, warts and all, perhaps.
Precisely. And this ties into the idea of unity, doesn't it?
How so?
Well, people often call for unity, but maybe expecting complete theological unity where everyone agrees on every historical detail or interpretation is probably unrealistic given this background.
Probably impossible, yeah.
But social unity, that seems more achievable, and perhaps is fostered through understanding and acknowledging each other's histories and perspectives, even the difficult parts.
Rather than ignoring or condemning the differences out of hand.
Exactly.
Understanding can build bridges even where theological agreement isn't possible.
That's a really important point. Thank you. Okay, to kind of wrap this part of our dive, I want to leave our listeners with a question. It's one that came up in the discussions we researched. Okay, imagine this. If you were given a blank mushaf, a blank physical book right now, could you personally write down only what is absolutely verbatim from Allah with zero possibility of any human intervention or historical variation having crept in based on everything we know? Just sit with that question. Think about what it implies about certainty and transmission.
That's a powerful thought to ponder.
So we've taken quite a journey, haven't we, through centuries of Quranic scholarship. And I think it shows the story of the Quran's compilation, its preservation. It's just far more layered, more nuanced than often presented.
It really is. It's a reminder that even things we think are settled history can have these fascinating, complex depths.
And this, I hope, reinforces the idea that real knowledge, true understanding, often comes from looking at all the sources, even the ones that challenge what we thought we knew.
That willingness to engage with the intricacies, the difficult bits, that's the core of what we try to do in the deep dive, giving you those insights that go beyond the surface level.
Definitely. So maybe a final thought to leave everyone with: how might our understanding change, not just of the Quran, but of any sacred text, any historical document, if we apply this same kind of rigorous internal self-examination, if we openly discuss all the historical accounts, all the variant readings, all the complexities within its own tradition?
A challenging but potentially very fruitful question.
Thank you for joining us on this podcast episode.